evidence points to a combination of factors. Climate change causing reduced Nile floods, overextension of resources on monument building, and growing power of provincial nomarchs who challenged royal authority. Egypt fragmented into competing regions. Nomarchs declared themselves independent rulers. Two major rival dynasties emerged, one based in Heracleopolis in Lower Egypt, another in Thebes in Upper Egypt. For over a century, Egypt endured civil war, famine, and cultural disruption. Literary texts from this period, like the Admonitions of Ipuwer and the Prophecy of Neferti, describe social chaos, poverty, and the breakdown of traditional order. While possibly exaggerated for literary effect, they reflect real trauma experienced during this period. Yet, even during this dark age, Egyptian culture persisted. Local rulers built temples, artists created beautiful objects, scribes continued writing. This wasn't a return to barbarism, but a period of political decentralization, during which Egyptian culture actually spread more widely throughout society. Around 2055 BCE, Mentuhotep II, a pharaoh from Thebes in Upper Egypt, finally defeated his rivals and reunified Egypt, establishing the 11th dynasty and inaugurating what historians call the Middle Kingdom. Mentuhotep built an innovative mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, combining pyramid, temple, and tomb in a unique design that influenced later constructions. He presented himself as Egypt's savior, the man who restored Ma'at, the cosmic order that Egyptians believed was essential for civilization. The 12th dynasty, beginning around 1985 BCE, represents what many scholars consider classical Egyptian civilization. These pharaohs were master administrators who reorganized the government, launched massive irrigation and land reclamation projects, and created efficient bureaucratic systems that would influence all subsequent Egyptian history. Pharaohs like Amenemhat III transformed the Fayum Depression into a productive agricultural region, building dams, canals, and reservoirs in one of history's first large-scale environmental engineering projects. This wasn't just conquest, it was the creation of new land, new wealth, and new possibilities for Egypt's growing population. These pharaohs also built a chain of massive fortresses in Nubia, controlling trade routes and projecting Egyptian power deep into Africa. These weren't simple military outposts, but sophisticated administrative centers with complex layouts, multiple defensive walls, and impressive architectural features. The Middle Kingdom also produced Egypt's greatest literature. The story of Sinuhe, the tale of the shipwrecked sailor, wisdom texts, and love poetry all flourished during this period. Egyptian language evolved to its classical form, the standard that would be taught to scribes for centuries. Middle Kingdom art became more realistic, showing pharaohs with careworn faces rather than idealized perfection. This reflected a more complex view of kingship, acknowledging the burden of rule while maintaining divine status. Around 1650 BCE, central authority collapsed again. But this time, Egypt faced something unprecedented: foreign invasion and occupation. A Semitic people called the Hyksos, meaning rulers of foreign lands, gradually infiltrated the Nile Delta, eventually establishing their own dynasty, ruling from the city of Avaris. They brought new military technology, particularly the horse-drawn chariot, which gave them a decisive advantage. The Hyksos adopted Egyptian culture, worshipped Egyptian gods, and used Egyptian administrative systems. They didn't destroy Egyptian civilization, but ruled as pharaohs themselves, creating a complex cultural hybrid. However, Egyptian
Egyptian dynasties continued to rule in Thebes in the south. For nearly a century, Egypt was divided between Hyksos rulers in the north and native Egyptian rulers in the south, with Nubian kingdoms watching and sometimes intervening from further south. Around 1570 BCE, the Theban pharaoh Sekenenretau began military campaigns against the Hyksos. His mummy shows brutal head wounds, suggesting he died in battle. His sons continued the fight. Aya finally succeeded in expelling the Hyksos around 1550 BCE, pursuing them into Canaan to ensure they couldn't return. He reunified Egypt once again and established the 18th dynasty, inaugurating the new kingdom, Egypt's Imperial age. Importantly, the Egyptians learned from their conquerors. They adopted chariot warfare, improved metallurgy, and developed a more militaristic culture. The trauma of foreign occupation transformed Egypt from an inward-looking civilization into an aggressive empire. Through military campaigns north into Syria, Palestine, and south into Nubia, they created the largest territory Egypt would ever control, stretching from the Euphrates River to the fourth cataract of the Nile. Thutmose III, who reigned from approximately 1479 to 1425 BCE, was Egypt's greatest military strategist, personally leading 17 campaigns, conquering numerous cities, and establishing Egyptian dominance throughout the Near East. He's been called the Napoleon of ancient Egypt, though perhaps Napoleon should be called the Thutmose of France. Egypt became fabulously wealthy. Tribute flowed in from conquered territories, gold from Nubia, cedar from Lebanon, horses from Syria, exotic goods from throughout the known world. Egypt's pharaohs corresponded as equals with the kings of Babylon, Assyria, and the Hittites. But perhaps the most remarkable pharaoh of this dynasty was Hatshepsut, one of the few women to rule Egypt as pharaoh rather than queen. She came to power around 1473 BCE, initially as regent for her young stepson, but then declared herself pharaoh, complete with false beard and male regalia. Hatshepsut focused on trade and building rather than conquest. Her famous expedition to the land of Punt, documented in beautiful reliefs at her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, brought back myrrh trees, ebony, ivory, and gold. She built extensively throughout Egypt, creating some of its most beautiful monuments. The 18th dynasty also witnessed one of history's strangest episodes, the religious revolution of Akhenaten. Around 1353 BCE, this pharaoh abandoned traditional Egyptian polytheism, declaring that only one god existed, Aten, the sun disk. He moved the capital to a new city, Akhetaten, modern Amarna, and attempted to erase the old gods from Egyptian consciousness. Akhenaten's revolution produced a distinctive art style, with elongated skulls, curved bodies, and intimate family scenes previously unknown in Egyptian art. But it was deeply unpopular. After his death, his successors systematically destroyed his monuments, erased his name, and returned Egypt to traditional religion. One of those successors was the boy king Tutankhamun, who died young around 1323 BCE. Though relatively unimportant in his own time, his intact tomb, discovered in 1922, gave the world its most complete glimpse of royal burial practices and New Kingdom wealth. The 19th dynasty produced Egypt's most famous pharaoh, Ramesses II, known as Ramesses the Great, who reigned for an astonishing 66 years from 1279 to 1213 BCE. Ramesses was Egypt's greatest builder, constructing more monuments, statues, and temples than any other pharaoh. His colossal statues dominated the landscape. His cartouches appeared on buildings throughout Egypt, and his mortuary temple, the Ramesseum, was among the largest ever built. His greatest achievement was Abu Simbel, carved directly into a mountainside in Nubia. 4 massive seated statues of Ramesses, each 67 feet tall, guard the entrance to a temple that extends 180 feet into the rock. Twice a year, on specific dates, sunlight penetrates deep into the temple to illuminate statues of the gods in the inner sanctuary, a feat of astronomical and architectural precision. Ramesses also fought the Hittite Empire at the Battle of Kadesh around 1274 BCE, one of the largest chariot battles in history. Though Ramesses claimed total victory in his inscriptions, the battle was actually a stalemate. What's more significant is what followed: the first recorded peace treaty in human history, establishing recognized borders and mutual defense obligations between Egypt and the Hittites. Ramesses lived into his 90s, outliving many of his children and wives. His mummy, discovered in a cache of royal mummies in 1881, shows an elderly man with red hair, arthritic joints, and evidence of dental disease. Even in death, his presence commands respect. But maintaining an empire proved expensive. Later, New Kingdom pharaohs struggled with economic problems, inflation, administrative corruption, and the constant need to defend distant territories. The great building projects became smaller, less frequent, less impressive. Around 1200 BCE, a catastrophe struck the entire eastern Mediterranean. Mysterious groups, collectively called the Sea Peoples, destroyed kingdoms throughout the region. The Hittite Empire collapsed completely. Many Canaanite cities were burned. Egypt barely survived, with Ramesses III fighting off multiple invasions. Ramesses III successfully defended Egypt, but at enormous cost. His reign marked the last period of significant Egyptian power. After his death, Egypt entered a period of slow decline, with the empire gradually fragmenting. The high priests of Ammon in Thebes controlled the south, while various dynasties ruled the north from cities like Tanis. At times, Egypt had multiple pharaohs simultaneously, each claiming legitimacy. Libyan military commanders who had settled in Egypt gradually gained power, eventually establishing their own dynasties. These Libyan pharaohs adopted Egyptian culture completely, proving once again that Egyptian civilization was defined by culture, not ethnicity. The Nubian Renaissance, the 25th dynasty. But the most remarkable development came from the south. The kingdom of Kush in Nubia, which had maintained Egyptian cultural traditions even when Egypt itself declined, invaded and conquered Egypt around 747 BCE. The Nubian pharaohs of the 25th dynasty, particularly Taharqa, presented themselves as restorers of true Egyptian tradition. The message is clear. Through military conquest, the two lands have become one. Nama established his capital at Memphis, strategically located at the junction between Upper and Lower Egypt. From here, he could control both regions, monitor the crucial trade routes, and project power in all directions. With this act, ancient Egypt as we know it was born, and the age of the pharaohs began. But Nama wasn't just a king in the ordinary sense. He established a concept that would define Egyptian civilization for 3 millennia, the pharaoh as living God. The pharaoh wasn't merely appointed by the gods, he was a god incarnate, specifically the living embodiment of Horus, the falcon-headed sky god. This concept of divine kingship has deep African roots. Throughout the continent, from ancient Kush to medieval Mali, from great Zimbabwe to Ethiopia, African cultures recognized their rulers as sacred intermediaries between the human and divine realms. Egypt took this concept and developed it to its ultimate expression. Supporting the pharaoh's divine status was an increasingly powerful priesthood. These weren't simple religious officials. They were scholars, astronomers, mathematicians, and keepers of sacred knowledge. They interpreted the will of the gods, performed complex rituals, and advised the pharaoh on matters of state. The most important priests served in the temples of major deities like Ra, the sun god, Osiris, the god of the afterlife, and Ta, the creator god. But every nome, every town, every village had its local deities and local priests. Religion permeated every aspect of Egyptian life, from the grandest state ceremony to the humblest farming ritual. Behind every great pharaoh stood brilliant architects and engineers. Men like Imhotep, who would later serve Pharaoh Djoser in the Third Dynasty, represented a class of highly educated, highly skilled professionals who turned royal visions into stone reality. These architects understood geometry, astronomy, materials, science, and logistics. They commanded vast workforces, organized supply chains stretching hundreds of miles, and solved engineering problems that still impress us today. They were the unsung heroes of Egypt's golden age. Perhaps no group was more important to Egyptian civilization than the scribes. In a society where literacy was rare, scribes held enormous power. They recorded royal decrees, calculated taxes, documented legal proceedings, copied religious texts, and maintained the historical records that allow us to know this story today. Becoming a scribe required years of training, learning thousands of hieroglyphic symbols, mastering several scripts, and understanding mathematics, law, and religious texts. But the reward was significant. Scribes could rise to positions of great authority regardless of their birth status. It was one of the few paths to social mobility in ancient Egypt. But Egypt's greatness wasn't built by pharaohs, priests, and scribes alone. It was built by millions of ordinary people, farmers who worked the fields, craftsmen who created beautiful objects, soldiers who defended the borders, sailors who navigated the Nile, and laborers who built the monuments. Recent archaeological work has revealed that these weren't slaves, as Hollywood would have us believe. They were paid workers, often organized into specialized teams with housing, food rations, and even medical care provided. They took pride in their work, leaving behind graffiti marking their team's accomplishments. We must also recognize the crucial role of Nubia in Egypt's development. Nubians weren't just neighbors or conquered peoples. They were partners, rivals, sometimes rulers, and always an integral part of Egypt's story. Nubian kingdoms had their own pharaohs, their own pyramids, their own sophisticated culture. At times, Nubian pharaohs ruled Egypt itself, particularly during the 25th dynasty. The relationship between Egypt and Nubia was complex, but fundamentally, it was a relationship between African siblings, not between Europe and Africa, as later colonial narratives would suggest. With Nama's conquest around 3100 BCE, Egypt entered the dynastic period. The first dynasty established Memphis as the administrative capital and began the process of integrating two very different regions into a cohesive state. This wasn't easy. For generations after unification, tensions remained between Upper and Lower Egypt. Early pharaohs spent much of their energy balancing competing interests, suppressing rebellions, and creating new traditions that could unite both regions under a shared identity. The double crown, combining the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt, became the ultimate symbol of unified rule. Royal titulary became increasingly complex, with pharaohs taking on multiple names reflecting their dominion over both lands. The early pharaohs established their primary burial ground at Abydos in Upper Egypt, a site that would remain sacred throughout Egyptian history. These early royal tombs were impressive structures, though modest compared to what would come later. Inside these tombs, archaeologists have discovered sophisticated grave goods, finely crafted furniture, jewelry, pottery, and even wine jars labeled with vintage years. This was a civilization already developing complex industries, trade networks, and a refined aesthetic sense. Disturbingly, evidence from First Dynasty tombs suggests that royal burials included human sacrifice, with servants killed to accompany the pharaoh into the afterlife. This practice, found in several early African kingdoms, would eventually be abandoned in favor of symbolic servant figures called Ushabti. The Second Dynasty and internal conflict. The Second Dynasty was marked by internal religious and political conflict. Some pharaohs of this period took names associated with Set, the god of chaos and the desert, rather than Horus, suggesting a power struggle between different factions or regions. Archaeological evidence shows that several Second Dynasty pharaohs faced serious rebellions. Some monuments were deliberately damaged. Some records were erased, suggesting violent political upheavals. Egypt's unity was still fragile, still being tested. The last pharaoh of the Second Dynasty, Khasekemwy, managed to restore unity, taking a name that meant the two powers appear. His reign marked a turning point, setting the stage for Egypt's first true golden age. Around 2670 BCE, Pharaoh Djoser commissioned a tomb unlike any seen before. His architect Imhotep created the Step Pyramid at Saqqara, the world's first large-scale stone building and the prototype for all pyramids to come. The Step Pyramid started as a traditional mastaba tomb but was expanded upward in stages, creating a six-layered structure rising over 200 feet high. It was surrounded by a complex of temples, courtyards, and ceremonial buildings, all enclosed within a massive limestone wall. Imhotep himself would be remembered as one of history's greatest geniuses, later deified as a god of wisdom and medicine. He represented the pinnacle of African intellectual achievement, a man who revolutionized architecture, astronomy, and medicine in one lifetime. The Fourth Dynasty represents the absolute pinnacle of pyramid construction. Three pharaohs, Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure, built the three great pyramids of Giza, monuments so precisely engineered, so impossibly massive, that they've sparked wonder and speculation for millennia. The Great Pyramid of Khufu, completed around 2560 BCE, contained approximately 2.3 million stone blocks, some weighing up to 70 tons, transported from quarries miles away and assembled with gaps between blocks smaller than a human hair. It stood 481 feet tall, making it the world's tallest structure for over 3,800 years. How was this achieved? Recent archaeological discoveries suggest a combination of methods: ramps, both straight and spiral, water channels for lubrication, teams of workers organized with military precision, and possibly technologies we've yet to fully understand. Excavations of workers' villages near the pyramids reveal that these monuments were built by paid Egyptian workers, not slaves. They lived in organized towns, received regular food rations, including meat and beer, and had access to medical care. Graffiti left by work gangs shows pride in their labor, with teams competing for prestige. The Great Sphinx, likely built during Khafre's reign, adds another layer of mystery. This colossal limestone statue with a human head and lion's body has sparked endless debate about its age, purpose, and symbolism. Some evidence suggests it might be even older than the pyramids themselves, possibly carved from a natural limestone outcrop in pre-dynastic times. 5th and 6th dynasties, refinement and expansion. The 5th dynasty shifted focus somewhat from a pyramid building to the construction of sun temples, reflecting the growing importance of the sun god Ra. Pyramids continued to be built, but were smaller and used different construction techniques. However, this period gave us one of Egypt's most important innovations, the pyramid texts. These are the oldest religious writings in human history, carved into the walls of pyramid burial chambers, providing spells, prayers, and instructions for the pharaoh's journey through the afterlife. The 6th dynasty saw aggressive expansion southward into Nubia and eastward into Sinai. Pharaohs sent trading expeditions to the land of Punt, somewhere on the Red Sea coast, bringing back exotic goods like myrrh, ebony, and leopard skins. This period also gives us some of our first biographical texts. Nobles began decorating their tombs with detailed accounts of their achievements, giving us invaluable insights into daily life, warfare, trade, and administration during the Old Kingdom. Around 2200 BCE, the Old Kingdom collapsed. Imagine standing before a structure so massive, so perfectly engineered, that even with all our modern technology, we struggle to understand how it was built. Now imagine that this monument is over 4,000 years old, constructed by a civilization that emerged from the heart of Africa when most of the world was still living in scattered villages. Before Greece, before Rome, before Babylon, there was Egypt, a kingdom so powerful, so advanced, that it would rule for 3,000 years, longer than any empire in human history. But here's what they don't tell you in school. Ancient Egypt didn't begin with pyramids and golden masks. It began with something far more mysterious, far more African than most history books dare to admit. This is the untold story of how Africa gave a birth to one of humanity's greatest civilizations, a story of Black Pharaohs, forgotten kingdoms, and a legacy that changed the world forever. Welcome to Africa Hidden History. Today, we journey back to the very beginning of recorded civilization, to a time when the Nile River Valley transformed from scattered communities into the most sophisticated society the ancient world had ever seen. In this documentary, we will uncover the true origins of ancient Egypt, tracing its roots deep into African prehistory. We'll explore how the first pharaohs united a divided land, how they built monuments that still defy explanation, and how they created systems of writing, medicine, mathematics, and governance that would influence every civilization that came after. But this isn't just a story about pyramids and mummies. This is a story about African innovation, African spirituality, and African power. We'll examine the evidence that mainstream historians often overlook, the connections between ancient Egypt and other African civilizations, and the deliberate erasure of Egypt's African identity in modern scholarship. We'll meet the pharaohs who ruled as living gods, the priests who guarded sacred knowledge, the architects who built for eternity, and the ordinary people who made it all possible. We'll witness the rise of dynasties, the construction of immortal monuments, and the creation of a culture so influential that its echoes still resonate 5,000 years later. By the end of this journey, you'll understand not just how ancient Egypt rose to greatness, but why this story matters today. You'll see how Africa didn't just contribute to world civilization. Africa created the very foundation upon which all other civilizations were built. Let's begin. Our story begins approximately 12,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age. As massive ice sheets retreated across the northern hemisphere, the climate of North Africa underwent a dramatic transformation. What is now the Sahara Desert was once a green, fertile landscape filled with rivers, lakes, and abundant wildlife. Archaeological evidence reveals that ancient African peoples thrived in this region, hunting game, gathering plants, and creating some of humanity's earliest rock art. These weren't primitive savages, these were sophisticated hunter-gatherers who understood astronomy, tracked seasons, and developed complex spiritual beliefs about their relationship with nature. But around 5000 BCE, the climate shifted again. The Sahara began its transformation into the desert we know today. This wasn't a sudden catastrophe, but a gradual process spanning centuries. As grasslands turned to dust and water sources dried up, the peoples of North Africa faced a choice: migrate or die. Many groups moved southward into sub-Saharan Africa, carrying their knowledge and culture with them, but others turned east toward one of the few water sources that remained reliable, one of the few places where life could still flourish. They turned toward the Nile. The Greek historian Herodotus called Egypt the gift of the Nile, and he wasn't exaggerating. This single river, flowing over 4,000 miles from the heart of Africa to the Mediterranean Sea, created a narrow ribbon of fertility through an otherwise barren landscape. Every year, like clockwork, the Nile would flood, depositing rich dark soil along its banks. This wasn't destructive flooding, but a predictable, life-giving phenomenon. The ancient Egyptians called this fertile soil Kemet, meaning black land, in contrast to the Deshret, the red land of the desert. This reliable agricultural cycle meant that communities along the Nile could settle permanently, plant crops, and build surplus food stores. Surplus food meant population growth. Population growth meant specialization of labor, and specialization meant the development of arts, crafts, administration, and eventually civilization itself. By 5000 BCE, dozens of independent communities had established themselves along the Nile. Archaeological excavations have revealed sophisticated settlements with organized layouts, specialized workshops, and evidence of long-distance trade. At sites like Badari, Nakada, and Hierakonpolis, we find evidence of advanced pottery making, metalworking, and artistic traditions. These weren't isolated villages, they were interconnected communities that traded goods, shared ideas, and gradually developed common cultural practices. The art from this period reveals a distinctly African aesthetic, similar to traditions found throughout the continent. Elongated figures, ceremonial objects, and spiritual symbolism all point to shared cultural roots with other African peoples. Over centuries, these communities began to coalesce into two distinct regions. In the north, where the Nile spreads into the Mediterranean, numerous settlements formed what would be called Lower Egypt, represented by the Red Crown. In the south, along the narrow river valley, communities united into Upper Egypt, represented by the White Crown. These weren't just geographical divisions. They represented different cultures, different deities, and different ways of organizing society. Lower Egypt was wetter, more accessible to foreign trade, and culturally diverse. Upper Egypt was more isolated, more traditional, and maintained stronger connections to African spiritual practices. This is crucial to understand. Ancient Egypt did not develop in isolation from the rest of Africa. Archaeological and genetic evidence shows clear connections between early Egyptian populations and peoples from Nubia to the south, the Sahara to the west, and the Horn of Africa to the southeast. The religious practices, burial customs, artistic styles, and social structures of pre-dynastic Egypt all show African origins. The worship of animal deities, the importance of ancestor veneration, the concept of divine kingship, all these are fundamentally African traditions that Egypt would refine and elaborate, but not invent. Particularly important was the relationship with Nubia, the land immediately south of Egypt. Nubian culture was, in many ways, more advanced than early Egypt. Nubia had earlier kingdoms, earlier monumental architecture, and maintained crucial trade networks, bringing gold, ivory, ebony, and exotic goods from deep in Africa. By 3500 BCE, the stage was set for something unprecedented in human history. The Nile Valley had everything needed for civilization. Reliable food sources, natural defenses in the form of deserts on both sides, a highway for transportation and communication in the form of the river, and most importantly, a population of skilled, innovative people with centuries of accumulated knowledge. Settlements were growing into towns, towns were developing hierarchies, local leaders were becoming chiefs, chiefs were becoming kings, and kings were looking beyond their own borders, dreaming of something greater. The age of the pharaohs was about to begin. Before we meet the legendary pharaohs who would unite Egypt, we must understand the people they ruled. Ancient Egyptians were a diverse population, but overwhelmingly of African origin, with features reflecting the full spectrum of African phenotypes. Modern DNA studies and skeletal analysis consistently show that ancient Egyptians were indigenous Northeast Africans sharing genetic markers with Nubians, Ethiopians, and other African populations. The famous Egyptologist Sheikh Anta Diop spent decades proving what should have been obvious. Ancient Egyptians were Black Africans. Pre-dynastic Egypt was divided into approximately 42 regions called nomes, each governed by a local ruler called a nomarch. These nomarchs controlled irrigation systems, collected taxes, administered justice, and commanded small armies. Some nomarchs were more powerful than others, controlling strategic locations, fertile lands, or important trade routes. Competition between these local rulers drove innovation in warfare, administration, and monument building. Each wanted to prove their power and secure their legacy. One of the most mysterious figures from this period is known to us only as Scorpion, named after the hieroglyph symbol found near his image on ancient artifacts. The scorpion mace head discovered at Hierakonpolis shows a ruler wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt, performing a ceremonial irrigation ritual. Scorpion appears to have been one of the first rulers to attempt unification of multiple nomes under a single authority. They renovated temples, revived old religious practices, and built pyramids in both Egypt and Nubia. These Black Pharaohs from deep in Africa ruled Egypt for nearly a century. The Nubian civilization that produced these pharaohs was sophisticated in its own right, with its own writing system, Meroitic script, iron-working technology, and distinctive artistic traditions. The relationship between Egypt and Nubia was always one of cultural exchange, not simple domination. The Nubian dynasty ended when the Assyrian Empire, armed with superior iron weapons, invaded Egypt around 671 BCE. After brutal warfare, the Nubians withdrew to their homeland in the south, where their civilization would continue to flourish for another 1,000 years. The late period saw brief moments of restored Egyptian independence, particularly under the 26th dynasty, when pharaohs like Psamtik I reunified Egypt and attempted to revive its glory. But Egypt was now surrounded by greater powers and could never again achieve its former dominance. In 525 BCE, the Persian Empire conquered Egypt, making it a province of the largest empire the world had yet seen. Some Persian rulers respected Egyptian culture and ruled as pharaohs. Others were brutal and exploitative. Egyptian nationalism never died, leading to repeated rebellions. In 332 BCE, Alexander the Great of Macedon conquered Egypt, ending Persian rule. The Egyptians welcomed him as a liberator. Alexander visited the oracle of Amun at Siwa Oasis, where he was declared the son of Amun, a pharaoh in the Egyptian tradition. Alexander founded Alexandria, which would become one of history's greatest cities, a center of learning, trade, and culture that blended Egyptian, Greek, and Near Eastern influences. When Alexander died in 323 BCE, his general Ptolemy took control of Egypt, establishing the Ptolemaic dynasty. The Ptolemaic period, Greek pharaohs. The Ptolemies ruled Egypt as pharaohs for nearly 3 centuries, from 323 to 30 BCE. They adopted Egyptian royal regalia, built temples to Egyptian gods, and maintained many Egyptian traditions, while simultaneously promoting Greek culture and language. They made Alexandria a beacon of learning, establishing the Great Library and the museum, where scholars from throughout the Mediterranean world studied, conducted research, and expanded human knowledge. This was the city where Euclid wrote his geometry, where Eratosthenes calculated Earth's circumference, where the Septuagint translation of the Hebrew Bible was created. The last Ptolemaic ruler and the last pharaoh of independent Egypt was Cleopatra VII. Contrary to popular belief, Cleopatra was an intellectual and a skilled politician who spoke multiple languages, including Egyptian, the first Ptolemaic ruler to do so in centuries. Her relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony were political alliances aimed at preserving Egyptian independence against Roman expansion. She nearly succeeded, but the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE ended her hopes. Rather than be paraded through Rome as a captive, she chose death, reportedly by snake bite, in 30 BCE. With Cleopatra's death, Egypt became a Roman province. The age of the pharaohs, which had lasted over 3,000 years, finally ended. For centuries, Western scholarship has systematically denied or minimized Egypt's African identity. European and American museums, textbooks, and popular media have consistently depicted ancient Egyptians as white or Middle Eastern, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. This erasure began with Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798. French scholars accompanying his army were amazed by Egypt's monuments, but immediately began constructing narratives that separated Egypt from Africa. They claimed Egypt must have been founded by migrants from Asia or even Europe, refusing to credit African peoples with such achievements. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, racist pseudoscience invented increasingly absurd theories. Ancient Egyptians were a lost white race. They were descended from Atlanteans. They came from a sunken continent. Anything but the obvious truth that they were indigenous Africans. Modern genetic studies consistently show that ancient Egyptians were indigenous Northeast Africans, closely related to modern Ethiopians, Somalis, and Sudanese populations. Skeletal analysis shows African features. Artistic depictions in tombs show people with dark skin, particularly in Nubian contexts. African scholars, particularly Senegalese physicist and historian Cheikh Anta Diop, spent decades proving Egypt's African identity through linguistic analysis, melanin testing of mummies, cultural comparisons, and historical documentation. His work, though initially dismissed by European academics, has been increasingly vindicated by modern science. Egyptian religion wasn't unique or borrowed from Asia. It was fundamentally African. the worship of animal deities, the importance of ancestor spirits, the concept of divine kingship, elaborate burial practices, and the emphasis on cosmic balance all have clear parallels throughout African civilizations. The Dogon people of Mali have astronomical knowledge strikingly similar to ancient Egyptian beliefs. The Yoruba of Nigeria have pantheons of gods resembling Egyptian deities. The concept of Ma'at, cosmic balance, appears throughout African philosophical traditions. These aren't coincidences, but evidence of shared African cultural foundations. A linguistic analysis reveals connections between ancient Egyptian and various African language families. Coptic, the latest form of the Egyptian language, survived into the modern era in the Egyptian Christian Church and shows clear African linguistic structures. One of the most persistent myths is that the pyramids were built by slaves, particularly Hebrew slaves as depicted in biblical stories and Hollywood movies. This is completely false. Archaeological evidence overwhelmingly shows that pyramids were built by paid Egyptian workers. Recent discoveries have revealed sophisticated construction techniques, internal ramps spiraling up inside the pyramid structure, water channels to reduce friction when moving blocks, precise astronomical alignments for orientation, and mathematical knowledge that allowed perfectly level bases and precise angles. Graffiti left by workers shows they were organized into teams with names like Friends of Khufu or Drunkards of Menkore. They took pride in their work. This was a national effort with workers from throughout Egypt participating in a project that would ensure their pharaoh's immortality and, by extension, Egypt's cosmic harmony. The workers' cemetery at Giza shows that laborers received medical care, were buried with honors, and were not treated as disposable slaves. This was organized labor on a grand scale, but it was Egyptian labor, African labor, building monuments that would outlast empires. Another hidden truth is the remarkable status of women in ancient Egypt. Compared to most ancient civilizations, Egyptian women enjoyed remarkable rights and freedoms. They could own property, conduct business, divorce their husbands, serve as priests, and even rule as pharaohs. Legal texts show women controlling their own wealth, making contracts, and bringing lawsuits. Marriage was viewed as a partnership, not ownership. Women weren't veiled or secluded, but participated fully in public life. While Hatshepsut and Cleopatra are famous, they weren't alone. Sobekneferu ruled in the 12th dynasty. Tausret ruled at the end of the 19th dynasty. Several queens served as regents wielding real power. This wasn't an accident, but reflected deeper cultural values about female capability and divine feminine power. Egyptian religion placed goddesses in positions of ultimate power. Isis was the goddess of magic, more powerful than even Ra. Hathor was the goddess of love, joy, and also violence. Sekhmet was the lion-headed warrior goddess who nearly destroyed humanity. Divine power wasn't exclusively masculine in Egyptian thought. Ancient Egypt possessed medical knowledge far ahead of its time. The Edwin Smith papyrus, dating to around 1600 BCE but copying older texts, describes 48 surgical cases with remarkable anatomical accuracy. It distinguishes between treatable, possibly treatable, and untreatable conditions. A rational approach to medicine. Egyptian physicians performed surgery, set broken bones, treated wounds, prescribed medications, and even created prosthetics. A mummy from around 950 BCE was found with a prosthetic big toe made of wood and leather, fully functional and showing signs of long use. Egyptian mathematics was sophisticated enough to calculate the volume of pyramids, determine the area of circles, solve linear equations, and work with fractions. The Rind mathematical papyrus shows the Egyptians understood geometry, algebra, and practical mathematics centuries before the Greeks. Egyptian astronomy allowed precise calendar creation, prediction of Nile floods based on stellar observations, and orientation of buildings to celestial events. The Egyptian calendar of 365 days was later adopted by Rome and forms the basis of our modern calendar. Perhaps the most suppressed aspect of Egyptian history is its intimate relationship with Nubia. Western scholarship has often portrayed Nubia as Egypt's primitive southern neighbor, when in reality, Nubian civilization was often equal to or ahead of Egypt. Recent archaeological work shows that in pre-dynastic times, Nubia may have been more culturally advanced than Egypt. The A group culture in Nubia had wealthy burials and long-distance trade before similar developments in Egypt. Some scholars now argue that the concept of kingship itself may have traveled north from Nubia to Egypt. The 25th dynasty proves that Nubians could rule Egypt as successfully as any native Egyptian dynasty. The cultural exchange between Egypt and Nubia was a bi-directional, with ideas, gods, artistic styles, and technologies flowing both ways. When Egypt fell to foreign powers, Nubian kingdoms continued to thrive. The kingdom of Kush maintained Egyptian cultural traditions, built pyramids more than Egypt itself, and survived until 350 CE, long after Egypt had lost its independence. In the year 1897, British soldiers forced their way into the ancient city of Benin. What they discovered inside stopped them in their tracks. Bronze sculptures of such artistic perfection that European scholars refused to believe Africans could have created them. Palaces stretching for miles, roads wider than anything in London. A civilization so advanced, so sophisticated, that it challenged everything the colonial powers believed about Africa. But here's what they don't teach you in school. Benin was not alone. 600 miles to the northwest, another empire had already reigned supreme for over 4 centuries. The Oyo Empire, a military superpower that commanded cavalry forces larger than most European armies. An economic giant that controlled trade routes stretching across West Africa. A political system so complex it would inspire modern concepts of checks and balances. These weren't primitive kingdoms waiting to be civilized. These were world powers, and their stories reveal a truth that was deliberately buried. Africa didn't need saving. Africa was thriving. This is the hidden history of the Oyo and Benin empires. For centuries, the narrative about pre-colonial Africa has been controlled by those who conquered it. We were told that Africa had no history before European contact. No complex societies, no sophisticated governance, no achievements worth remembering. But the archaeological evidence tells a radically different story. Today, we are going to explore 2 of West Africa's most powerful empires, the Oyo Empire and the Kingdom of Benin. These weren't small tribal societies. These were vast organized states with populations in the millions, armies that numbered in the tens of thousands, and political systems that rivaled anything in Europe or Asia. We'll journey through their rise to power in the forests and savannas of what is now Nigeria. We'll witness their golden ages when art, culture, and commerce flourished. We'll examine their complex governmental systems, their military innovations, and their economic dominance. But most importantly, we'll uncover how these empires resisted colonialism, how they were ultimately dismantled, and why their stories were systematically erased from global history. By the end of this documentary, you will understand why the colonizers feared these empires. You'll see why they had to destroy not just the political structures, but the very memory of African greatness. Because remembering Oyo and Benin means confronting an uncomfortable truth.
The African Dark Continent narrative was always a lie designed to justify conquest. Let's begin where these empires began, in the heart of West Africa, centuries before any European ever set foot on their shores. One picture, West Africa in the 14th century. This is not the Africa of colonial imagination, empty, wild, uncivilized. This is a region already ancient with human activity, crisscrossed by trade routes thousands of years old, home to cities that had risen and fallen before Rome was even founded. The region we're focusing on encompasses modern-day southern Nigeria, stretching from the Atlantic coast inland to the savanna grasslands. The geography here creates two distinct zones, and this division would shape two very different kinds of power. To the south, you have the tropical rainforest belt, dense jungle, heavy rainfall, humid conditions. The Great Forest extends from the coast northward for about 200 miles. Rivers cut through this green expanse: the Niger Delta, the Benin River, countless tributaries creating natural highways through the vegetation.
To the north, the forest gradually gives way to woodland savanna, more open territory, Guinea grass growing head-high, scattered trees providing shade. This is cavalry country where horses can thrive and mounted warriors can charge across open ground. These two geographical zones would give birth to two different imperial models. The forest would nurture Benin, a kingdom built on artistic excellence, forest resources, and control of southern trade routes. The savannah would forge Oyo, a cavalry empire built on military might and control of northern trade networks. When these empires rose to prominence, the world looked very different from today. The year is approximately 1300 CE. The Mali Empire under Mansa Musa dominates the Western Sahel, and its gold making it perhaps the wealthiest state on earth. Great Zimbabwe stands in southeastern Africa, a stone city of remarkable architecture. The Swahili city-states control East African trade with the Islamic world and beyond. This is Africa's classical age, a period of empire building, cultural flowering, and economic expansion that would continue for centuries. Understanding these empires requires understanding the peoples who built them. The Kingdom of Benin was built by the Edo people, master bronze casters who had lived in the forest regions for millennia. The Oyo Empire was built by the Yoruba people, one of West Africa's largest and most culturally influential ethnic groups, with a unique civilization built around city-states. Both peoples had sophisticated religious systems. They believed in a supreme creator God, beneath whom existed a pantheon of orishas or deities, each controlling different aspects of life and nature. Ancestors played a crucial role, serving as intermediaries between the living and the divine. Religion wasn't separate from politics. It was woven into every aspect of governance, law, and social organization. Before we dive into the political histories, we need to understand what made these regions wealthy enough to support large-scale states. Agriculture formed the foundation, but the real wealth came from trade. West Africa sat at the intersection of multiple trade networks. Trans-Saharan routes brought salt, textiles, and horses from North Africa and the Islamic world, exchanging them for gold, ivory, cola nuts, and later enslaved people. The military technology of this era shaped how power was exercised. In the forest regions, fighting took place on foot. The dense vegetation made cavalry impossible. Warriors fought with spears, machetes, bows, and arrows, and shields. In the savanna regions, the horse changed everything. Cavalry could strike fast, cover great distances, and dominate infantry forces. But horses came at a cost. They had to be imported from the north. as the tsetse fly in forest regions killed them. Maintaining a cavalry force required wealth, expertise, and continuous trade relationships with northern suppliers. Both regions had metallurgical traditions. Iron smelting and blacksmithing provided the weapons and tools that made organized warfare possible. Benin's bronze casting tradition demonstrated sophisticated metalworking knowledge that would create some of the world's greatest art. With this geographical, cultural, and economic foundation in place, we can now turn to the empires themselves. Two different paths to power, two different models of African state building. At the heart of the Benin Empire stood one figure, the Oba. This wasn't just a king in the European sense. The Oba was a divine ruler, a living god, the spiritual and temporal center of the universe for his people. His power was absolute in theory, though in practice it was balanced by complex institutions. The dynasty that we'll focus on begins with Oba Eward the Great, who ruled approximately from 1440 to 1473. Before Ewara, Benin was already an established kingdom, but he transformed it into an empire. Surrounding the Oba were the palace chiefs, known as the Uzama, hereditary nobles who claimed descent from the original founders of the kingdom. They held significant power, particularly in choosing new Obas. Then came the town chiefs, appointed by the Oba himself from among commoners who had distinguished themselves. The Iyoba, or Queen Mother, held her own power center. She maintained her own palace, controlled her own villages, and served as a crucial advisor to the Oba. The position was established by Oba Ezigi in the early 16th century to honor his mother Idia, who had helped him win a succession war. What made Benin unique among African empires was its extraordinary artistic tradition, organized through craft guilds. The Bronze Casters Guild worked exclusively for the palace, creating the famous Benin bronzes that would later astound European audiences. These weren't primitive artifacts, they were sophisticated lost wax castings that rivaled anything produced in Renaissance Europe. Now we shift northward to Oyo, where power was structured very differently. The ruler of Oyo bore the title Ala-Afin, meaning owner of the palace. Like the Oba of Benin, the Ala-Afin was considered semi-divine, but the Ala-Afin's power, while immense, was more constrained by constitutional checks than the Obas. The Oyomesi were a council of 7 high chiefs who served as the kingmakers and the primary check on royal power. These weren't merely advisors, they held real power. The Oyomesi could reject an Ala-Afin's decisions. More dramatically, they could order an Ala-Afin to commit ritual suicide if they determined he had failed in his duties or lost the favor of the gods. The leader of the Oyomesi was the Bashorun, essentially a prime minister. The Bashorun commanded the army when the Ala-Afin did not personally lead it. This constitutional structure created a fascinating balance of power. The Ala-Afin held religious authority and controlled the vast palace bureaucracy. The Oyomesi held military power and the ultimate sanction of removal. Oyo's true distinctive feature was its cavalry. The Are Onakakanfo was the supreme military commander, appointed by the Ala-Afin but required to live outside the capital. This position came with a harsh rule. The Are Onakakanfo was forbidden to return to the capital except in victory. If he lost a major battle, he was expected to commit suicide. The cavalry itself was divided into specialized units. Heavy cavalry armed with spears and protected by quilted armor. Light cavalry serving as scouts and skirmishers. Mounted archers who could fire from horseback. By its peak, Oyo could field 10,000 mounted warriors, the largest cavalry force in West African history. By the late 15th century, a new set of actors entered the West African stage. European merchants. Portuguese traders first, followed by Dutch, British, French, and others. Initially, these Europeans were supplicants, not conquerors. They built trading posts on the coast only with permission from African rulers. They paid customs duties. They negotiated as partners, not masters. In Benin, European traders dealt with designated officials who controlled coastal access. Europeans seeking to trade with Benin had to present gifts, observe proper protocols, and accept Benin's terms. Both empires developed sophisticated merchant classes who operated the long-distance trade networks. These weren't small-time traders. The wealthiest merchants commanded resources that rivaled minor nobles. They employed large numbers of people, owned significant property, and wielded considerable political influence. With these key figures and groups established, the divine rulers, the aristocratic counselors, the military commanders, the skilled artisans, the merchants, and the foreign traders, we can now turn to the chronological story of how these empires rose, flourished, and eventually faced the challenge of European colonialism. The story of Benin begins in mythology. According to oral tradition, the Edo people sent a delegation to Ile-Ife, the holy city of the Yoruba, requesting a prince to establish a new dynasty. The result was Eweka I, who became the first Oba of the new dynasty around 1180 CE. But it was Oba Ewar the Great, around 1440, whose reign would transform Benin from a regional kingdom into a sophisticated empire. Ewara rebuilt Benin City according to a grand plan. He ordered the construction of massive earthwork walls and moats that would eventually encircle the city. Modern archaeology has revealed that the Benin walls formed the largest earthwork complex in the world, stretching for over 16,000 kilometers. When all the connected sections are measured, they required moving more earth than the Great Pyramid of Giza. Within these walls, Eware laid out broad avenues in a grid pattern. He expanded the royal palace into a vast complex of courtyards, apartments, galleries, and ceremonial spaces. European visitors in later centuries would compare Benin City favorably to Amsterdam or Lisbon. Eware also established the tradition of royal bronze casting. He commissioned magnificent bronze plaques to cover the palace pillars, depicting historical events, battles, and ceremonial occasions. These bronzes served as visual records of royal history and expressions of royal power. While Benin was flourishing in the forest, Oyo was struggling in the savannah. In the late 15th century, Oyo faced invasion by the Nupe kingdom from the northeast. The Nupe had cavalry, Oyo did not. The result was catastrophic. The Nupe overran Oyo, forcing the Alaafin and his people into exile. But the Oyo people in exile learned crucial lessons. They learned about cavalry warfare from the Bogu people who hosted them. They established trade connections that would allow them to acquire horses. They developed military tactics suited to savannah warfare. Around 1535, the Oyo people returned transformed. They now possessed cavalry forces trained and equipped to fight on the open grasslands. The returning Oyo army recaptured their homeland and immediately launched a campaign of expansion that would continue for 2 centuries. The cavalry made the difference. Oyo developed the largest cavalry force in West African history. No army in the forest regions could stand against them in open battle. Even powerful kingdoms had to acknowledge Oyo's supremacy or face devastating raids. In 1485, Portuguese ships reached the Benin coast. The early relationship was one of diplomatic equals. Benin sent ambassadors to Portugal. Portugal sent missionaries. Trade developed, but on Benin's terms. Initially, trade focused on pepper, ivory, and palm oil, but soon a darker trade began: enslaved people. Here's where Benin's story diverges from many African kingdoms. In the 1520s, under Oba SCHOO, Benin largely withdrew from the slave trade. The kingdom found the slave trade destabilizing and not as profitable as other commerce. This decision had profound consequences. It meant Benin avoided the economic dependency on the slave trade that would corrupt and ultimately destroy many African states. The 16th century represented Benin's apex of power and cultural achievement. European visitors left detailed accounts describing a city with straight, broad avenues, some as wide as any in Europe. The palace complex stretching for miles, markets bustling with trade, a population they estimated at hundreds of thousands, making Benin City one of the largest cities in Africa. The 17th century saw Oyo transform from a regional power into West Africa's dominant empire. Under successive Alafins, Oyo launched campaigns in all directions. They conquered the kingdom of Alada on the coast. They forced numerous Yoruba kingdoms to accept tributary status. By the mid-17th century, Oyo controlled the largest empire in Yoruba land's history. The capital, Oyo-Ile, grew into a major urban center with an estimated population of 100,000 or more. The empire's reach extended about 400 miles east to west and 200 miles north to south. Oyo developed a complex system for controlling its empire. Provincial capitals were governed by ajele, administrators appointed by the Alafin. The road system was crucial, allowing cavalry to deploy rapidly to suppress rebellions. The tributary system was carefully calibrated. Vassal kings retained their thrones and local authority as long as tribute was paid. The relationship with the kingdom of Dahomey illuminates how Oyo's system worked. In 1726, Oyo cavalry invaded Dahomey after it gained control of important coastal ports. The Dahomeyan army, which included famous female warrior units, fought bravely but couldn't stop the cavalry. Oyo imposed tributary status but didn't destroy Dahomey. This arrangement worked for decades, but it contained seeds of destruction. Dahomey's economy became increasingly dependent on the Atlantic slave trade. Moreover, Dahomey slowly built up its military capabilities and acquired firearms from European traders. While Oyo was expanding dramatically, Benin was following a different trajectory. The 17th and 18th centuries saw Benin maintain its power but adopt a more conservative, inward-looking stance. The kingdom continued to control its core territories and maintained its cultural sophistication, but Benin increasingly restricted European access to preserve its independence and cultural integrity. By the late 18th century, Oyo's political system was breaking down. In the 1770s, Bashorun Gaha seized effective control of the empire. He reduced a series of Alafins to powerless figureheads between 1754 and 1774. Gaha deposed or killed 4 Alafins. In 1774, Alafin Abiodun managed to rally support and overthrow Gaha. But the damage was done. The crisis had revealed fundamental weakness. When the checks and balances broke down, there was no mechanism to restore order except violence. Meanwhile, the Atlantic slave trade was fundamentally transforming West African economics. By the late 18th century, European demand for enslaved Africans had reached unprecedented levels. The economic incentives to participate in the slave trade became overwhelming, creating perverse incentives that militarized society and broke down trust. In the early 19th century, a religious revolution swept across the West African savannah. The Fulani Jihad, led by Usman Danfodio. By 1809, Danfodio's forces had conquered the Hausa kingdoms and established the Sokoto Caliphate. The jihadist armies then turned southward. Oyo's northern provinces came under attack. The empire that had once dominated the region now found itself on the defensive. The cavalry that had once seemed invincible now struggled to defend even core territories. The final collapse came swiftly. In 1817, Alaafin Aole faced a catastrophic situation. The Oyo Messi presented him with the parrot eggs, ordering him to commit suicide. According to tradition, Aole cursed Oyo before taking his own life. The empire disintegrated. In 1825, Fulani forces attacked and burned Old Oyo itself. The Alaafin and his people fled southward. What followed was chaos. The Yoruba civil wars. Former parts of the Oyo Empire fought each other for supremacy. These wars would continue for decades, creating exactly the weakness that European colonizers would exploit. While Oyo collapsed, Benin endured, but it too faced mounting pressures. In the early 19th century, Britain was pushing to end the Atlantic slave trade. Benin shifted focus to palm oil production. But European merchants wanted direct access, lower prices, and favorable treaties. Backed by military power, Benin resisted these pressures. The Obas maintained strict control over European access and refused to sign treaties that would compromise sovereignty. Through the mid-19th century, Benin maintained its independence, but it was an island of African autonomy in a region increasingly dominated by European power. In 1884 to 1885, European powers met in Berlin to divide Africa among themselves. No Africans attended, lines were drawn on maps, territories were assigned, the scramble for Africa was formalized, Britain claimed authority over the region around Benin. Throughout the 1890s, British officials pressured Benin to sign treaties that would make it a protectorate. Oba Ovon Ramwen refused. He maintained that Benin was an independent kingdom and would remain so. In January 1897, a British delegation led by James Phillips decided to force the issue. Despite warnings about a sacred period, Phillips marched to Benin City. His party was killed. The British response was overwhelming and brutal. They assembled a military force of 1,200 men equipped with modern weapons, Maxim guns, artillery, and rifles against Benin's muskets and traditional weapons. In February 1897, British forces advanced on Benin City. The Edo warriors fought bravely, but it was a technological mismatch. The Maxim guns could fire 600 rounds per minute. The British forces captured and burned Benin City. They deliberately destroyed the palace complex. They looted thousands of bronze plaques and sculptures, ivory carvings, and other treasures. They took this to England, where they were sold to museums and private collectors. Oba Ovon Ramwen fled, but was eventually captured. The British deposed him and sent him into exile, where he died in 1914. Benin's independence, maintained for over 6 centuries, ended in violence and plunder. The looting of Benin's treasures had profound consequences. When the Benin bronzes arrived in Europe, they caused a sensation. The artistic sophistication was undeniable. This created a problem for colonial ideology. European scholars invented absurd theories, claiming Africans couldn't have made them. The British conquest of Yoruba land was more gradual but equally complete. The Yoruba civil wars had exhausted the region. The British positioned themselves as mediators. By 1900, Britain formally declared the protectorate of southern Nigeria. By 1914, the diverse peoples of the region were subjects of the British Empire. The standard colonial narrative portrayed African societies as primitive and lacking governmental sophistication. But the reality of Oyo and Benin reveals something very different. Consider Oyo's constitutional system. The Oyo Messi could force an Alaafin to commit suicide if he failed in his duties. This concept that rulers can be held accountable and removed through institutional processes is often presented as a European innovation, but Oyo had developed similar principles independently centuries before European contact. The balance between the Ala Afin's religious authority and the Oyo Messi's political power created a system of checks and balances. Neither could act alone. This prevented the emergence of absolute tyranny. Benin developed different mechanisms for similar ends. The tension between hereditary nobles and appointed officials created competing power centers. The Iyoba could influence decisions independently. The craft guilds held economic power that gave them political leverage. These weren't primitive despotisms. These were sophisticated political systems that managed competing interests and created mechanisms for succession and accountability. Another hidden element is the role of women in these empires. The Iyoba of Benin was a major political figure controlling her own palace and resources. The first Iyoba, Idia, literally helped her son win a civil war. In Oyo, market women controlled much of the commercial economy through powerful guilds. Western education and literacy are often used as markers of civilization. But Oyo and Benin had sophisticated intellectual traditions. The Ifa divination system required Babalawa priests to memorize thousands of verses containing history, medicine, philosophy, and practical wisdom. This oral literature was vast and complex. Benin's bronze plaques weren't merely decorative, they were historical records that could be read by those trained in their symbolic language. The organization of craft guilds represented systematic technical education. Both empires operated sophisticated tax systems and economic regulation. This wasn't simple village economy. This was commercial capitalism, African style, with division of labor, specialized production, market systems, and long-distance trade requiring credit systems and commercial contracts. Perhaps the most hidden element is that the erasure of these achievements was deliberate. Colonial powers needed to justify their conquest. If Africans had sophisticated civilizations, colonialism couldn't be justified as bringing civilization to the uncivilized. So the evidence was suppressed. The Benin bronzes were locked away. Oral traditions were dismissed. Archaeological investigation was minimal. The very questions scholars asked were shaped by assumptions of African inferiority. Both empires employed resistance strategies beyond military confrontation. Benin's restriction of European access was economic resistance. By controlling trade, Benin maintained sovereignty even as a European power grew. This diplomatic resistance delayed colonization for decades. When the British conquered Benin, cultural resistance didn't end. The Edo people preserved their practices, oral traditions, and social structures even under colonial rule. They maintained the institution of the Oba even when reduced to ceremonial status. Similarly, the Yoruba maintained their language, religion, and cultural practices. This cultural resistance ensured that when independence came, these peoples had strong identities and traditions to build upon. The colonizers could conquer the political systems, but they couldn't completely erase the cultures. The Oyo and Benin empires fundamentally shaped modern Nigeria's political landscape. When Britain created Nigeria in 1914, they were artificially joining peoples who had never been united. But the Yoruba and Edo shared experience with large-scale state organization that would prove crucial. After independence in 1960, the Yoruba political elite championed federalism, dividing power between central and regional governments. This concept had roots in the old Yoruba city-state system and Oyo's tributary empire model. Even today, traditional rulers, Obas in Benin, the Alafin in Oyo, hold no official political power but command enormous cultural authority. Their immediate disputes maintain cultural traditions and provide legitimacy. Politicians quote traditional rulers because they represent continuity with pre-colonial sovereignty. The artistic traditions of Benin continue to influence global art. The Benin bronzes became world famous, influencing European modernist artists and proving African art was sophisticated. Today, contemporary Nigerian artists draw on this heritage. The ongoing campaign for repatriation has become a global cause, with museums finally beginning to return pieces to Nigeria. Yoruba cultural traditions similarly endure. Yoruba religious practices have experienced a global revival. The Orisha traditions developed during Oyo's era are now practiced worldwide, particularly in the African diaspora in the Americas. Perhaps the most important legacy is what these empires teach us about African agency and resistance. Oyo and Benin were not passive victims. They were active agents building empires, developing complex systems, creating artistic masterpieces, and conducting sophisticated diplomacy. When Europeans arrived, these empires engaged on initially equal terms. Even when European power grew overwhelming, resistance continued. The eventual conquest required overwhelming military force and technological advantage. These empires didn't fall because Africans were inferior. They fell because industrialized European powers brought Maxim guns to fight against muskets and spears. Understanding this is crucial for how Nigerians and Africans generally understand their own history. The narrative shifts from "we were primitive and needed civilization" to "we had sophisticated civilizations that were violently destroyed." Beyond Nigeria, these empires have global significance. They prove that complex state organization, sophisticated art, and economic development were not European monopolies. They demonstrate that the scramble for Africa was the violent conquest of established civilizations by technologically superior invaders. For the African diaspora, these empires provide connection to heritage. Many enslaved people came from these regions. Understanding that their ancestors came from sophisticated civilizations changes how diaspora peoples understand their identities. The legacies remain contested and relevant today. The fight for repatriation continues. The question of how traditional institutions fit into modern democracy continues. The memory of pre-colonial greatness informs Pan-African movements. These aren't just ancient stories. They are living legacies shaping how millions understand themselves, their cultures, and their place in the world. So what is the big lesson here? What should we take away from the story of Oyo and Benin? At the most basic level, this story demolishes the lie of African primitiveness. These were sophisticated civilizations. They had complex governments with checks and balances. They had professional armies. They had vibrant the artistic traditions. They had the economic systems that participated in global trade networks. They had philosophical and spiritual traditions that provided meaning and order to people's lives. When Europeans claimed they were bringing civilization to Africa, they were lying. Civilization already existed. What they brought was conquest, exploitation, and cultural destruction. But the lesson goes deeper than just correcting historical lies. These empires show us that there are multiple paths to civilization. Oyo and Benin developed political systems, artistic traditions, and economic structures that didn't look like European ones, but that worked for their contexts. The Yoruba city-state system was different from European nation-states, but it was no less sophisticated. Benin's bronze casting was different from European artistic traditions, but it was no less beautiful or technically accomplished. The colonial assumption was that there was one right way to organize society, one right way to create art, one right way to govern, and that way was European. Everything else was primitive, backwards, inferior, But Oyo and Benin prove that assumption wrong. Human beings in different environments with different resources and challenges will create different solutions. Diversity of approach is a strength, not a weakness. There is no single civilization. There are civilizations, plural, each valid in its own context. Another crucial lesson is about the nature of conquest and historical memory. These empires didn't fall because they were weak or inferior. They fell because they faced technologically superior invaders at a moment of internal weakness. Oyo was torn apart by civil war and external invasion before Europeans colonized the fragments. Benin resisted for decades but eventually faced Maxim guns with muskets. Technology and timing matter in history. The fact that one civilization conquers another doesn't prove moral or cultural superiority. It often just proves that one side had better weapons at a particular moment, and yet the conquerors write the history. The British, who burned Benin City and looted its treasures, claimed they were ending barbarism. They portrayed the Obas as tyrants and Benin as backwards. They ignored or minimized the sophistication, the artistic achievement, the political complexity. This pattern repeated across Africa. Conquerors justified their violence by portraying their victims as primitive and savage. And for over a century, these lies became accepted truth in much of the world. Recovering the real history of empires like Oyo and Benin is therefore an act of justice. It's about giving voice to people who were deliberately silenced. It's about honoring achievements that were deliberately forgotten. It's about telling the truth after generations of lies. But perhaps the most profound lesson is about resistance and resilience. These empires fell. Their political power was destroyed. Their territories were colonized. Their peoples were subjected to foreign rule by conventional measures they lost. And yet, the Yoruba people endure. The Edo people endure. Their languages are spoken by millions. Their cultural traditions continue. Their art inspires new generations. The institutions of the Aleafin and Oba survive, transformed but unbroken. The memory of empire persists. This is a different kind of victory, not a military victory, but a cultural and spiritual one. The colonizers could conquer the kingdoms, but they couldn't destroy the peoples or completely erase their cultures. This resilience matters. It means that when independence came, these peoples had strong identities and traditions to build upon. It means that today, Nigerians can look back with pride on their ancestors' achievements. It means that the African diaspora can claim connection to sophisticated civilizations, not just victimhood and enslavement. The story of Oyo and Benin is ultimately a story about human dignity and the impossibility of completely destroying a people's spirit. Every bronze mask that is returned to Nigeria is a small victory. Every student who learns the real history of these empires is a correction of colonial lies. Every time someone says Africa had great civilizations before colonialism, they are honoring the memory of Oyo and Benin. These empires matter not just as historical curiosities, but as proof that African peoples have always been creative, capable, and fully human. That shouldn't need proving, but after centuries of dehumanization, the proof matters. The kingdoms fell, the memory endures, and in that endurance lies hope. Not just for understanding the past, but for building a future where all civilizations are recognized as equally valid expressions of human creativity and achievement.
The story of the Oyo and Benin empires is one of many hidden histories across the African continent. From the stone cities of Great Zimbabwe to the scholarly traditions of Timbuktu, from the coastal kingdoms of the Swahili to the highland civilizations of Ethiopia, Africa's past is filled with achievements that challenge everything we were taught about history. But these stories remain hidden only because they haven't been widely told.
And that's where you come in. If this documentary opened your eyes to African history you never learned in school, hit that subscribe button. We're going to keep uncovering these hidden histories, one empire, one kingdom, one achievement at a time. Like this video, if you want to see more content about pre-colonial African civilizations, leave a comment telling us which African empire or kingdom you want us to cover next. The Songhai Empire, the Kingdom of Congo, the Ashanti, Great Zimbabwe. Let us know. Share this video with someone who needs to know that Africa's history is rich, complex, and worthy of study. Every share helps correct the false narratives that have dominated for too long. Next time, we'll explore another chapter in Africa's hidden history. We'll uncover another story of achievement, resistance, and resilience that's been deliberately buried. Because remembering is resistance, knowledge is power, and the truth about Africa's past changes everything about how we understand the present. This is Africa Hidden History. The story continues. In the year 1897, British soldiers forced their way into the ancient city of Benin. What they discovered inside stopped them in their tracks. Bronze sculptures of such artistic perfection that European scholars refused to believe Africans could have created them. Palaces stretching for miles, roads wider than anything in London. A civilization so advanced, so sophisticated, that it challenged everything the colonial powers believed about Africa. But here's what